It began the night the sky wrote a message no one was ready to read. His name was Jacob Whitmore, 47 years old, a mechanic in a town so small it didn't appear on most maps, Marfa, Texas, where the desert stretched forever and the stars hung low enough to touch. He lived in a trailer behind his shop, a place cluttered with engine parts and coffee cups and photographs he couldn't bear to throw away. His daughter had died 3 years earlier in a car accident. His wife had left 6 months after that, unable to look at him without seeing the ghost of what they'd lost. Jacob stayed behind with his tools and his silence, and a Bible his mother had given him that he opened sometimes, but never really read. He wasn't looking for answers. He'd stopped asking questions a long time ago, but the universe, it seemed, had other plans. It was late October when the news first broke. Astronomers had detected an object moving through the solar system, something they were calling 3I Atlas. Interstellar, they said, a comet from beyond our sun's reach, traveling on a trajectory that defied easy explanation. The media buzzed for a few days, then moved on to other stories, but Jacob noticed something strange. Every night when he stepped outside to smoke a cigarette before bed, he could see it. A faint streak of light moving slowly across the sky, brighter than it should have been, more deliberate than any comet he'd ever seen, and it felt like it was watching him. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Comets didn't watch. They didn't think. They were ice and rock, dumb matter drifting through the void. But the feeling persisted, a pressure at the back of his skull, a knowing that settled into his bones. Something was coming. Something had already arrived. The night it happened, Jacob was alone in his shop, working late on a carburetor that had been giving him trouble for days. The radio played softly in the corner, old country songs about lost love and empty highways. The air smelled of oil and rust and the faint sweetness of desert sage drifting through the open door. He was tightening a bolt when the lights flickered, once, twice, then went out completely. Jacob straightened, his wrench still in hand, his breath shallow. The radio had gone silent. The hum of the refrigerator in the corner had stopped. The world had fallen into a stillness so complete it felt like the earth itself had stopped spinning. And then he felt it, a vibration, not in the air, but in his chest. A low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like the note of a bell struck inside his ribs. He turned toward the door. The desert outside was glowing. Not with firelight or headlights, but with something else, a pale, shimmering luminescence that poured across the sand like liquid silver. It moved with impossible grace, flowing toward the shop, pooling at the threshold. Jacob's heart hammered, his hands trembled, but he didn't run. He walked forward step by step until he stood in the doorway, staring out at the light. And then, from the center of it, a figure emerged. Tall, slender, humanoid in shape, but not in substance. Its form seemed to shift between solidity and translucence, as if it were made of glass and starlight. Its eyes were large and dark, but not empty. They held something Jacob recognized but couldn't name. Peace. The being didn't speak, didn't move, but words formed in Jacob's mind, not as thoughts but as presence, a language older than language. Do not be afraid. Jacob's knees buckled. He gripped the doorframe, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Tears he didn't understand welled up in his eyes. The being stepped closer, and the light around it softened, dimmed, became warm instead of blinding. It raised one long, delicate hand and pointed upward. Jacob looked. The sky had changed. The stars were no longer scattered randomly across the darkness. They had arranged themselves into patterns, symbols he didn't recognize but somehow understood. And there, moving slowly through the constellations, was 3I Atlas, brighter now, pulsing with a steady, rhythmic light. The being's voice resonated through him again. What you call a comet is not a comet. It is a sign, a message written in fire and ice, sent across the void by those who have walked this path before you. It carries the frequency of awakening, the sound of the trumpet, the call to remember. Jacob's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but no words came. The being continued. Your people have many names for what is coming, the rapture, the ascension, the return, but these are only shadows of the truth. What approaches is not an event, but a threshold, a doorway opening between worlds. Those who are ready will step through. Those who are not will remain, but they will not be abandoned. They will be given more time, more chances, because love does not force. It invites, it waits, it never gives up. Jacob's vision blurred. His body felt weightless, as though gravity had released its hold on him. The being reached out and touched his forehead with one finger, and everything changed. Images flooded his mind, not visions, not dreams. Memories that weren't his own. He saw the Earth from space spinning slowly in the blackness, blue and fragile and impossibly beautiful. He saw civilizations rise and fall, empires turn to ash, oceans swallow continents. He saw humanity, brilliant and broken, luminous and lost, reaching always towards something beyond itself, something it could feel but never quite touch. He saw wars fought over gods and borders and resources. He saw children born, and elders dying, and lovers holding each other in the dark, whispering prayers to a sky that seemed too vast to care. And then he saw something else, a presence, infinite, woven through everything, not distant, but intimate, not judgmental, but compassionate. It had no face, no form, but it was there in every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of suffering and joy. It was what people called God, but it was so much more than the word could hold. The being's voice filled him again. The sign in the sky, what you call Three-Eye Atlas, is a lighthouse, a beacon sent by civilizations that ascended long ago. They travel the stars not as conquerors, but as shepherds. They have watched your world for millennia, waiting for the moment when humanity would be ready to understand. That moment is now. The veil is thinning, the old world is passing away, and the new world, the one you have always carried inside you, is emerging. Jacob gasped, his chest heaving, his hands clutching at the doorframe. The being stepped back, and the light around it began to pulse again. You will not remember all of this. Not yet, but you will carry it inside you. And when the time comes, you will know what to do. You will be a witness, not to convince, but to remind, because the truth cannot be forced. It can only be recognized. Jacob blinked, and the figure was gone. The light was gone. The stars returned to their usual chaos. He was alone in the doorway, his body trembling, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. But something inside him had shifted. Something had opened. The days that followed were strange. Jacob tried to return to his routine. He opened the shop at 8, fixed engines and transmissions and brake lines, drank too much coffee and smoked too many cigarettes, but everything felt different. Colors seemed sharper, sounds clearer. The world hummed with a frequency he'd never noticed before. He told no one. How could he? Who would believe him? A washed-up mechanic who saw a glowing figure in the desert and heard voices in his head. They'd think he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had, but the presence stayed with him. It wasn't intrusive, it didn't demand anything, but it was there, like a warmth in the corner of his awareness, a knowing that settled over him like a blanket. He found himself pausing in the middle of tasks, staring out at the horizon, feeling something vast and patient watching over him, not with judgment but with love. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the encounter, Jacob was working on a truck when a man walked into the shop, tall, thin, wearing a priest's collar. He introduced himself as Father Michael, passing through town on his way to El Paso. He said his car was making a strange noise, asked if Jacob could take a look. Jacob nodded and gestured to the bay. The priest pulled his car in, and Jacob popped the hood. As he worked, the priest stood nearby, watching the desert through the open door. He said he'd heard stories about this area, about lights in the sky, about people who saw things they couldn't explain. He asked Jacob if he'd ever seen anything strange. Jacob's hand stilled on the engine. He glanced at the priest, then back at the motor. He said sometimes the desert played tricks on people, that the heat and the isolation could make you see things that weren't there. The priest nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. He said he used to believe that too. But lately, he'd been wondering if maybe the opposite was true. That maybe the world was full of things that were there, but most people had forgotten how to see them. Jacob's throat tightened. The priest continued, his voice quiet. He said the Vatican had been studying phenomena like this for years, that there were committees, reports, classified documents, that the church was preparing for the possibility that contact, real contact, was imminent, and that when it came, it would change everything. He asked Jacob what he thought would happen if people discovered that the divine and the extraterrestrial were not separate, that angels and aliens might be the same thing, that heaven was not a place above, but a state of consciousness, a frequency. Jacob set down his wrench and looked the priest in the eye. He said he thought people would be terrified, because it would mean everything they believed was both true and wrong at the same time, that the stories were real, but not literal, that God was not a king on a throne, but a presence woven through all things, that salvation was not about escaping the world, but awakening within it. The priest smiled, his eyes glistening. He said that was the most faithful thing he'd ever heard. That night, Jacob stood outside his trailer, staring up at the sky. Three-Eye Atlas was brighter now, closer, moving with a purpose that defied the laws of celestial mechanics. And for the first time in 3 years, Jacob prayed. Not the rote prayers his mother had taught him, Not the desperate bargaining he'd done in the hospital when his daughter was dying, but something else, something deeper. He closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness. He said he didn't know if anyone was listening, but if they were, he wanted them to know he was ready, ready to see, ready to understand, ready to let go of the grief and the anger and the fear that had kept him small for so long. And as he spoke, he felt it, the presence, the warmth, the knowing, and a voice, soft as wind, resonated through him. You are loved. You have always been loved. Now live as if you know it. Jacob opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face, and smiled. The weeks that followed Jacob's prayer were filled with signs he could no longer ignore. Three-eyed Atlas grew brighter in the sky each night, defying the predictions of astronomers who said it should have dimmed by now. The object moved with a precision that seemed less like the random drift of celestial mechanics and more like the deliberate course of something navigating. Scientists argued in journals and on news programs, their voices tense with excitement and unease. Some called it a natural anomaly. Others whispered the word that no one wanted to say out loud. Jacob read the articles on his phone during slow afternoons at the shop. He learned that the Vatican Observatory had been tracking the object since July, that they had convened secret meetings with astronomers and theologians. He learned that the James Webb Space Telescope had detected chemical signatures that didn't match any comet ever studied, carbon dioxide emissions at temperatures that should have been impossible, periodic radio signals that seemed almost structured, almost intentional. And he learned that he was not alone. Reports began filtering through the internet, posted on forums and obscure websites by people who sounded desperate to be believed. A farmer in Nebraska who said a being of light had appeared in his cornfield and told him the comet was a trumpet call. A trucker in Montana who claimed she'd been shown visions of Earth transforming, the veil between dimensions dissolving like morning fog. A fisherman in Alaska who said he'd heard a voice in the aurora, telling him that what humanity called the second coming was not a person returning, but a frequency ascending. Jacob read these stories late at night, his trailer filled with the blue glow of his laptop screen, and felt the presence stirring in his chest, the warmth, the knowing, the confirmation that what he'd experienced was not madness, but contact. And then, one Thursday morning in early November, everything changed. Jacob was working on a transmission when a woman walked into his shop. She was in her 60s, grey-haired, wearing a simple dress and carrying a worn leather satchel. Her eyes were clear and steady, and when she looked at him, Jacob felt something shift in the air, a recognition, a resonance, as if they were two tuning forks vibrating at the same frequency. She introduced herself as Margaret. She said she'd driven 6 hours to find him, that she'd been directed here by something she couldn't explain, a voice, a feeling, a pull that wouldn't let her rest until she arrived. Jacob set down his tools and listened. Margaret said she was a teacher, that she'd spent 40 years in classrooms, trying to help children see the beauty in the world, the wonder in learning. But 3 months ago, her life had changed. She'd been standing in her garden at dusk when the sky had opened, not literally but perceptually, as if a curtain had been pulled back, and standing there, among her tomatoes and roses, had been a figure of light. It had told her that the object in the sky, the one they were calling Three-Eye Atlas, was not a comet. It was a beacon, a message sent by civilizations that had ascended beyond physical form, that existed now as consciousness woven through the fabric of space itself. They had been watching humanity for millennia, guiding it through prophets and mystics and dreams, waiting for the moment when the species would be ready to understand. That moment, the being had said, was now. Margaret's voice trembled as she spoke. She said the being had shown her things, visions of Earth's history, of wars fought over gods and resources, of children dying and mothers weeping and lovers holding each other in the dark. And through it all, a presence, vast, compassionate, patient, holding everything together, even when it seemed like the world was tearing itself apart. She said the being had told her that the transformation was not coming, it was already here. That Three-Eye Atlas was a catalyst, a vibrational signal that would accelerate the awakening in those who were ready, and that people like her and Jacob, people who had been contacted, were meant to be witnesses, not to convince or convert, but simply to live differently, to carry the frequency, to be proof that the veil could be crossed. Jacob listened, his throat tight, his eyes burning. He asked her why she'd come to him. Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening. She said because she'd been told to, that she'd seen his face in a dream, seen this shop, this town, this moment, that there were others like them, scattered across the country, across the world, all being drawn together by an invisible hand. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a notebook. Inside were names, addresses, phone numbers, a network of people who had experienced contact, who carried the same knowing, the same presence. She said they were gathering, not to form a religion or a movement, but simply to be together, to share what they'd seen, to hold space for the transformation that was unfolding. She asked if Jacob would join them. He looked down at the notebook, at the names written in careful handwriting, and felt something break open in his chest. He said yes. 3 weeks later, Jacob found himself sitting in a small chapel in the mountains of New Mexico, surrounded by 17 other people. They were farmers and nurses, mechanics and teachers, truckers and clerks, all ordinary, all humble, all carrying the same light in their eyes. One by one they told their stories. A man from Wyoming said he'd been alone in his workshop, building a chair when the wood had started to glow. A presence had filled the room, and he'd been shown a vision of the chair as a metaphor, that every human soul was being carved and sanded and shaped by experience, and that the finished form was not something to achieve, but something to remember. That wholeness was not created, but revealed. A woman from Louisiana said she'd been sitting on her porch during a thunderstorm when lightning had struck the oak tree in her yard. The tree had split open, but instead of flames, there had been light. A being had stepped through the light and told her that what humanity called destruction was often transformation, that the old had to break apart for the new to emerge, that death was not an ending, but a doorway. A trucker from Idaho said he'd been driving through the night when his engine had died on a deserted highway. He'd stepped out into the cold, and the stars had begun to sing, not with sound but with feeling, a vibration that had moved through him like music. A figure had appeared on the road ahead, radiant and calm, and had told him that every journey, no matter how long or difficult, was leading home, that separation was an illusion, that every soul was already where it needed to be. Each story was unique, but the message was the same. Wake up, remember, transform, and every single one of them mentioned Three-Eye Atlas. The being of light had pointed to the sky and said the object was a sign, a confirmation, a lighthouse sent by those who had already made the crossing, guiding humanity toward the same threshold. Jacob listened, his chest aching, his hands trembling in his lap. When it was his turn to speak, he told them about the night in the desert, about the light that had poured across the sand, about the being that had touched his forehead and filled him with visions he still didn't fully understand, about the voice that had told him the veil was thinning, that the transformation was not an event but a process, and that love was the only force powerful enough to carry a soul through the crossing. When he finished, the room was silent, and then, from the back, a woman stood. She was young, maybe 30, with dark hair and tear-streaked cheeks. She said her name was Sarah, that she was an astrophysicist, that she'd spent her career studying comets and asteroids, trying to understand the mechanics of the universe, but 6 months ago, she'd had an experience that had shattered everything she thought she knew. She'd been observing Three-Eye Atlas through a telescope when the object had flared, not with heat but with light, a pulse that had no natural explanation, and in that moment, she'd felt something reach into her mind, bypassing language, bypassing thought, and plant a seed of knowing. The object was not random. It was not natural. It was a probe, sent by intelligences so advanced they no longer needed bodies, no longer needed ships, but existed as fields of consciousness that could manipulate matter and energy at will. And it was not here to invade or destroy. It was here to remind. Sarah's voice broke. She said the Vatican knew, that astronomers around the world knew, that governments had been briefed, that classified reports existed, that conversations were happening in back rooms and conference halls about how to manage the disclosure when it became undeniable. But the truth, she said, was that disclosure didn't matter, because the transformation wasn't happening in governments or institutions. It was happening in people, in moments of contact, in experiences that couldn't be quantified or controlled. In the quiet, knowing that settled into ordinary lives and changed them from the inside out. She looked at Jacob, her eyes fierce and bright. She said people like them, witnesses, carriers, conduits, were the real disclosure, that every life touched by the presence, every heart opened by the contact, was a ripple spreading outward, changing the frequency of the collective, and that Three-Eye Atlas was amplifying it. That night after the gathering ended, Jacob stood outside the chapel staring up at the sky. The comet was directly overhead now, brighter than Venus, its tail stretching across the stars like a brushstroke of silver light. And as he watched, he felt it again, the vibration in his chest, the hum that came from everywhere and nowhere, and then, without warning, The presence spoke, not as words, not as thoughts, but as pure knowing, pouring into him like water into a cup. The sign is not for those who need proof. It is for those who are ready to see. The transformation is not a singular event. It is a wave, moving through time, through consciousness, through the fabric of reality itself. Some will ride it, some will resist it, but none will be untouched by it. The world you knew is ending. The world you have always carried inside you is beginning, and you, Jacob Whitmore, are one of the threads holding it together. Jacob fell to his knees, his hands pressed against the cold earth, tears streaming down his face. He whispered into the darkness, his voice raw and broken and full of something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Thank you. And the presence, warm and infinite, seemed to hold him. The months that followed were both ordinary and extraordinary. Jacob returned to his shop, fixed engines, drank coffee, smoked cigarettes on his porch at night, but everything had changed. He moved through the world now with a gentleness he hadn't known he was capable of. When customers came in angry or frustrated, he listened without reacting, and somehow by the time they left, they were calmer. When he passed strangers on the street, he smiled and they smiled back, as if recognizing something in him they couldn't name. He started visiting Margaret once a week. They would sit in her garden, drinking tea, talking about the things they'd seen and felt and learned. She told him about the others in the network, people all over the world who were experiencing the same awakening, the same contact, the same transformation. And she told him about the research. Scientists were beginning to understand that 3I Atlas was not behaving like any natural object. Its trajectory had shifted multiple times in ways that violated the laws of orbital mechanics. Its chemical composition was anomalous: carbon dioxide emissions at temperatures near absolute zero, periodic radio signals that seemed almost structured, and its timing, arriving during a period of unprecedented global upheaval, spiritual seeking, and collective anxiety, felt less like coincidence and more like synchronicity. Some researchers, like the Harvard astronomer who had studied Oumuamua, were beginning to suggest publicly that 3I Atlas might not be a comet at all, that it might be a probe, sent by an advanced civilization, carrying a message humanity was only beginning to decode. But Jacob didn't need scientists to tell him what he already knew. The object was a sign, a lighthouse, a trumpet call, and those who had ears to hear were hearing it. One night in late December, Jacob was lying in bed when he felt the presence again. Stronger this time, closer. He sat up, his heart pounding, and looked toward the window. The light was there, soft, warm, shimmering like water under moonlight, and standing in the center of it once again was the being. Jacob didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply sat there, his breath steady, his mind quiet, waiting. The being stepped forward, and its voice filled him. You have done well. You have carried the frequency. You have been a witness. But the time is coming when the witness will no longer be enough, when the knowing must become action, not forced, not loud, but deliberate, conscious, loving. Jacob's throat tightened. The world is dividing, Jacob, not into good and evil, but into frequencies. Some are ascending, some are resisting, and the gap between them is widening. You will be asked to stand in that gap, to be a bridge, to hold space for those who are crossing and those who are not. It will not be easy, but it is why you were chosen. The being raised one long, delicate hand and touched Jacob's chest, and in that moment, he felt something shift inside him. Not a healing, not a miracle, but an activation, a remembering of something he had always carried but never fully accessed. The being stepped back, and the light began to fade. The sign in the sky will soon pass, but the transformation will continue, and you will know what to do. Trust the presence, trust the love, and above all, trust yourself. Jacob blinked, and the being was gone. The room was dark, but inside him, something blazed. 3I Atlas passed through the solar system and continued on its trajectory into the void, leaving behind a trail of light and a world forever changed. Scientists debated its nature for years. Some insisted it was a natural object, a fragment of an exoplanetary system, chemically unusual but ultimately explainable. Others argued it was something more, a probe, a message, a confirmation that humanity was not alone. But for people like Jacob, the debate didn't matter, because the truth had already been written, not in data or equations, but in lives, in transformations, in the quiet knowing that settled into ordinary hearts and whispered the same thing over and over. You are loved. You have always been loved. Now live as if you know it. Jacob continued his work, fixed engines, served his community, lived simply and humbly. But those who knew him noticed something different, a light in his eyes, a peace in his presence, a knowing that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and the stars were bright, he would stand outside his trailer and look up at the sky, and he would feel it, the presence, the warmth, the infinite patience, and he would whisper into the darkness, "I'm ready." And the universe, vast and loving, would whisper back, "We know." Perhaps the sign was never meant to convince the skeptics. Perhaps it was always meant for those who were ready to see. Perhaps heaven was never a place we go to, but a frequency we tune into. Perhaps the angels were never separate from us, but reflections of what we are becoming. Perhaps God was never a distant judge, but the love that holds all things together, even when we forget it's there. And perhaps the beings who visit us in the night, in lights and visions and moments of impossible knowing, are not invaders or saviors, but family. Older siblings in a cosmic story, reaching across the stars to remind us of something we've always known but temporarily forgot, that we are infinite, that we are loved, that separation is an illusion, and that the transformation is not something to fear but something to embrace, because the kingdom of heaven was never above us. It was always within us, waiting patiently for us to remember. Truth or fiction, perhaps not even the storyteller knows. Here the stories exist to touch you and make you reflect. The magical only reveals itself to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on seeking certainties.